The Man Who Broke the Atlantic, The Untold Story of Peter Madsen and the Great Greenland Conspiracy. A historical thriller based on true events. Prologue, The Ice Holds Secrets. Nuuk, Greenland, December 17, 1988. The body was frozen solid, discovered face down in a crevasse on the Renland ice cap, 6,000 feet above sea level. At first, the Danish geologists who found him assumed he was a lost hunter or a modern climber who had strayed too far from his route. But as they chipped away the ice, something didn't add up. The clothing was all wrong: heavy wool trousers, a sealskin parka, leather boots with steel crampons that looked decades old. A leather satchel was frozen to his side, containing documents written in a language the geologists didn't recognize. Not Danish. Not Greenlandic. English. His journal, preserved perfectly by the sub-zero temperatures, began with a date that made no sense. June 14, 1937. Position: 72 degrees 14 minutes north, 27 degrees 45 minutes west. The Americans think I'm dead. Let them. By the time anyone reads this, the world will have changed forever. The geologist had stumbled upon something impossible. This man claimed to have died 51 years before he was found. And he had been running from someone, or something, that would rewrite everything known about American foreign policy, Nazi espionage, and the true cost of national security. This is the true story of Peter Madsen, immigrant, spy, traitor, patriot, and the only man to ever outwit J. Edgar Hoover, Heinrich Himmler, and Franklin D. Roosevelt simultaneously. A story buried so deep in classified archives that even the Freedom of Information Act couldn't fully excavate it. Until now. Peter Madsen never should have survived his childhood. Born on December 3, 1899, in Ran, on the Danish island of Bornholm in the Baltic Sea, he entered a world that seemed determined to erase him. His father, Lars Madsen, was a fisherman who drowned when Peter was 4, leaving the family destitute in a community where winter starvation was common. His mother, Ingeborg, took in washing and mending, working 16-hour days while Peter roamed the rocky coastline, teaching himself to read from discarded newspapers and stolen library books. What saved him was his memory. Photographic, relentless, almost supernatural. By age 7, he could recite entire pages of text after a single reading. By 12, he spoke Danish, German, Swedish, and was teaching himself English from a water-damaged copy of Moby Dick found in a shipwreck. By 15, he had committed to memory the schedules of every shipping line that passed through Bornholm's ports, a skill that would prove unexpectedly valuable. In 1917, with World War I raging and Denmark neutral but starving, 18-year-old Peter made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He stowed away on a Swedish cargo ship bound for New York, surviving on stolen hardtack and condensation from the hull. When discovered by the crew 3 days out of Copenhagen, he didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he offered a deal. He spoke German fluently and knew Bornholm's coastline intimately, information that could be sold to British intelligence monitoring Baltic shipping. The Swedish captain, no stranger to profitable arrangements, made him a cabin boy instead of throwing him overboard. Peter arrived at Ellis Island on March 14, 1917, with $3.47 in his pocket and a forged letter claiming he had agricultural skills. The truth was simpler: he would do absolutely anything to avoid returning to Bornholm's poverty. His first decade in America was a masterclass in self-invention. He worked as a longshoreman in Brooklyn, where he learned to navigate the ethnic politics of Irish, Italian, and Jewish gangs. He spent 2 years in Chicago, working at the Union stockyards and witnessing the Red Scare violence of 1919 to 1920 firsthand. He saw police beat striking workers, watched suspected communists dragged from their homes, and understood, perhaps earlier than most immigrants, that America in the 1920s rewarded those who could become whatever the moment required. By 1923, Peter Madsen had transformed himself. He spoke unaccented English with a slight Midwestern flatness, wore three-piece suits purchased from Jewish tailors on Maxwell Street, and carried business cards identifying him as a consulting engineer, despite having no formal education. He had learned 3 essential American skills: how to bluff authority figures, how to recognize valuable information before others did, and how to make himself indispensable while remaining invisible. What he hadn't learned was discretion. In October 1923, during a poker game in a Cicero speakeasy, Peter won $2,400 from a man who turned out to be a lieutenant in Al Capone's organization. When he refused to return the money, believing, correctly, that Capone's men would kill him regardless, he was beaten nearly to death and dumped in an alley with a warning: leave Chicago by morning or be buried there. Peter chose a third option. He went to the FBI. J. Edgar Hoover was 31 years old in 1924, newly appointed as acting director of what was then called the Bureau of Investigation, desperate to prove himself to a skeptical Congress and a crime-weary public. The Bureau was a mess, corrupt, politicized, and widely regarded as incompetent. Hoover's solution was radical. He would build an organization of university-educated, physically fit, absolutely loyal young men who would transform law enforcement into a scientific profession. Peter Madsen was none of these things. He was 25, foreign-born, self-educated, and carrying secrets that could destroy him. But he had something Hoover needed more than pedigree: detailed, verifiable intelligence about Chicago's bootlegging networks, including names, addresses, and financial arrangements that the Bureau had failed to penetrate. Their first meeting, according to a heavily redacted memo discovered in 2014, took place in a Washington boarding house on November 3, 1924. Peter proposed a simple arrangement. He would work for the Bureau as an undercover operative, infiltrating criminal and political organizations too foreign or too working class for Hoover's college boys to penetrate. In exchange, he wanted citizenship, protection from Capone's revenge, and eventually, a promise Hoover initially resisted: a position of genuine authority. Hoover's counteroffer was more pragmatic. Peter would serve as a confidential informant, a category that existed outside official personnel records. He would report to Hoover personally, bypassing the chain of command that the director was still constructing. His immigration status would be handled through connections at the State Department, and his compensation would depend entirely on results: no salary, no benefits, no official existence. Peter accepted. It was the original sin of his American life, the moment he traded legitimacy for power, transparency for access. He would spend the next 6 years becoming someone else entirely. Between 1924 and 1930, Peter Madsen built 17 separate identities, each documented in bureau files under the code name Scandinavian. He was Peter Miller, a Swedish communist organizer in Detroit. He was Piotr Majewski, a Polish anarchist in Buffalo. He was Paul Mason, an Irish Republican sympathizer in Boston. In each role, he attended meetings, organized strikes, and encouraged violent rhetoric while recording everything for Hoover's growing files on subversive activities. The work was morally corrosive in ways Peter didn't initially recognize. He befriended men and women who genuinely believed in revolution, in workers' rights, in an end to American inequality. He shared their meals, their fears, their hopes for their children. Then he documented their conversations, identified their leaders for arrest, and watched as the Bureau's raids destroyed organizations he had helped build from the inside. By 1929, Peter had participated in the arrests of over 200 suspected radicals, including several who would be deported to certain death in Fascist Italy and Soviet Russia. His efficiency earned him Hoover's personal attention and, increasingly, his trust. When the stock market crash destroyed the remnants of Peter's legitimate investments, a small construction company and a failing used car dealership, Hoover advanced him $5,000 from Bureau discretionary funds, creating a debt of gratitude that Peter would never fully escape. But 1930 brought a crisis that exposed the fundamental instability of Peter's position. A Detroit communist named Sarah Goldstein, arrested based on his testimony, committed suicide in her cell rather than testify against her comrades. Her note, published in left-wing newspapers, accused the Scandinavian traitor By name, Peter's operational security had failed. Within weeks, he received death threats from multiple revolutionary organizations, and Hoover concluded that his most valuable undercover asset was burned in America. The solution came from an unexpected quarter. On March 12, 1930, President Herbert Hoover, no relation to Edgar, signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, triggering a trade war that would devastate international commerce. Among its victims was the Danish colony of Greenland, suddenly cut off from European markets and facing economic collapse. The Danish government, desperate for American investment and protection, opened secret negotiations for a trade agreement that would eventually become the 1941 Greenland Defense Agreement. Edgar Hoover saw opportunity. Greenland was strategically positioned between North America and Europe, unmapped, unguarded, and rich in cryolite, a mineral essential for aluminum production that Nazi Germany desperately needed. If the Bureau could place an operative in Greenland with credible cover as a businessman or explorer, the intelligence potential was enormous. And the perfect candidate was a Danish-born agent who now needed to disappear from American revolutionary circles. Peter Madsen didn't want to go. He had spent 6 years constructing an American identity, however fraudulent. He had a fiancée in Maryland, investments in a Florida land scheme, and plans for legitimate respectability. Greenland meant starting over in a frozen wilderness, thousands of miles from the civilization he had fought to join. Hoover made the offer impossible to refuse. The Sarah Goldstein suicide had created legal exposure. Congressional investigators were asking questions about Bureau informants who may have entrapment. Peter could testify, face possible criminal charges, and certainly public disgrace. Or he could accept a new assignment, complete with $50,000 in operating funds, Danish diplomatic cover as a commercial attaché, and a guarantee, written in Hoover's own hand, locked in a private safe, that his service would eventually be rewarded with full exoneration and reinstatement. Peter chose Greenland. On September 14, 1930, he sailed from Baltimore aboard the Danish freighter Jylland, carrying a false passport in the name, Peter Freuchen, borrowed without permission from a famous Danish Arctic explorer, and instructions to establish commercial contacts while reporting any German, British, or Soviet activities in the territory. He would not set foot in the United States again for 8 years. And when he returned, he would be running for his life. Greenland in 1930 was not a country. It was a colony, governed from Copenhagen with a paternalism that bordered on paralysis. The native Inuit population survived through subsistence hunting, supplemented by occasional Danish trade. The coastline was dotted with Moravian missionary stations and Royal Greenland Trading Department outposts, connected by dogs led in winter and unreliable coastal steamers in summer. The interior ice cap, 660,000 square miles of uninhabited glacier, had been crossed exactly twice in recorded history. The intelligence he gathered was explosive. Germany was indeed establishing covert weather stations, 3 on the east coast by 1934, but the meteorological data was secondary to a larger strategic purpose. The stations were practice runs for submarine warfare, testing how long German personnel could survive in isolation, how supplies could be delivered undetected, and how radio communications could be maintained across vast distances. Heinrich Himmler himself had taken personal interest in Greenland, believing that Aryan, ice warriors, could be trained in Arctic conditions for future campaigns against the Soviet Union. Peter's reports to Washington, declassified in 2001, show a sophistication that surprised his handlers. He understood that the German presence was part of a larger pattern of scientific imperialism, using civilian research as cover for military preparation. He documented Japanese meteorological teams in the Aleutians, Soviet geological surveys in northern Canada, and British attempts to claim unoccupied portions of the Arctic archipelago. In a prescient 1934 memo, he warned that the next war will be won or lost in polar regions, and the United States is currently blind north of 70 degrees latitude. Hoover was impressed. The Bureau's influence was growing. After 1935, it would be called the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but its jurisdiction remained technically domestic. Peter's Greenland operation existed in a legal gray zone, funded through diverted accounts, and reported only to Hoover personally. The director began to view his Arctic operative not just as an asset but as a prototype for the global intelligence network he secretly dreamed of building. But Peter was changing in ways that worried his handlers. The isolation of Greenland, the genuine friendships he formed with Inuit hunters and Danish administrators, the moral clarity of survival in extreme conditions, all of this was eroding the cynical utilitarianism of his undercover years. He began to question the value of the intelligence he provided. Did knowing German positions matter if no one in Washington would act on the information? Was he protecting America, or merely feeding Hoover's appetite for secrets? The crisis came in 1935. A German meteorologist named Hans Kramer, with whom Peter had developed genuine friendship, confessed that he was actually an SS officer assigned to evaluate Greenland for possible annexation in a future war. The scientific station was cover for a military base that would control North Atlantic shipping lanes. Kramer was tormented by the deception. He had come to love Greenland and its people, and asked Peter's advice on whether to defect. Peter reported the conversation to Washington, as required. But he also told Kramer to wait, to gather more documentation, to make any defection maximally valuable. For 3 months, he played a double game, protecting his friend while extracting information about German plans. When Kramer was suddenly recalled to Berlin in October 1935, almost certainly because SS counterintelligence had grown suspicious, Peter made a decision that crossed the line from intelligence operative to something more complicated. The plan was desperate and barely coherent. Peter arranged for Kramer to be killed in a crevasse fall during a routine ice survey, providing the SS with a body, actually a deceased Inuit hunter dressed in Kramer's clothing, and helping the living Kramer escape to Canada via a supply route Peter had established for his smuggling operations. The cost was enormous: $12,000 in bribes, the permanent alienation of several Inuit collaborators who now had lethal leverage over Peter, and the exposure of his entire Greenland network to potential German investigation. Kramer reached Montreal in February 1936, where Peter had arranged for him to contact British intelligence. The defection was a minor sensation in intelligence circles, a mid-level SS officer with detailed knowledge of German Arctic strategy. But it was handled quietly, buried in the larger drama of the Renland remilitarization and the Spanish Civil War. Peter received a terse commendation from Hoover and a warning. Personal initiatives regarding foreign assets must be pre-cleared. Future unauthorized actions will result in immediate termination. What Peter couldn't know, what no one would know for 60 years, was that Kramer's defection had triggered an SS investigation that would eventually identify Peter Frutchen as an American agent. The real Peter Frutchen, the famous explorer whose identity Peter had borrowed, learned of the impersonation during a 1936 visit to Copenhagen and filed a complaint with Danish police. The resulting file, discovered in Danish archives in 2008, reveals that by 1937, German intelligence had connected the dots. The American, commercial attaché in Greenland was actually a bureau operative with a history of radical infiltration. What Peter couldn't know, what no one would know for 60 years, was that Kramer's defection had triggered an SS investigation that would eventually identify Peter Frutchen as an American agent. The real Peter Frutchen, the famous explorer whose identity Peter had borrowed, learned of the impersonation during a 1936 visit to Copenhagen and filed a complaint with Danish police. The resulting file, discovered in Danish archives in 2008, reveals that by 1937, German intelligence had connected the dots. The American, commercial attaché in Greenland was actually a bureau operative with a history of radical infiltration. Himmler himself took interest. The SS chief had become obsessed with Greenland as a testing ground for his racial theories, and the penetration of his operations by a former communist infiltrator was intolerable. In March 1937, he authorized special handling of the Madsen problem, a euphemism that SS officers understood to mean assassination or abduction for interrogation. Peter learned of the danger from his most reliable Inuit source, a hunter named Kuhlaut who had been paid to monitor German radio traffic from a hidden position near the Scoresby Sun station. The message was simple. They know. They come. Peter had perhaps 2 weeks before an SS team could reach Greenland, traveling under cover of a legitimate meteorological relief expedition. His options were limited. He could flee to Canada, abandoning 8 years of work and exposing himself to Hoover's fury at the wasted investment. He could try to negotiate with the Germans, trading his knowledge of American intelligence structures for his life, a betrayal that would make him a permanent exile. Or he could disappear into the ice cap itself, using the survival infrastructure he had built to outlast the search and reemerge when the political situation changed. He chose the ice. But first, he made one final report to Washington, a message so explosive that he believed it would force the Roosevelt administration to finally take Greenland's strategic importance seriously. The report, transmitted via a Canadian fishing boat's radio in April 1937, made 3 claims that would have been dismissed as paranoid fantasy if they came from any other source. First, that Germany was actively planning to seize Greenland in the event of war with Britain, using established weather stations as bridgeheads. Second, that Japan was coordinating with Germany to simultaneously attack Alaska and the Aleutians, cutting American supply lines to Asia. And third, the most disturbing claim, that elements within the U.S. State Department were actively suppressing intelligence about these threats, either from isolationist conviction or possible foreign influence. Peter had no direct evidence for the third claim. It was intuition, born from years of watching his most important reports disappear into bureaucratic silence, from sensing the hostility of certain diplomats when Greenland was discussed, from recognizing patterns of obstruction that suggested something more systematic than incompetence. But in his desperation, he made the accusation explicit, naming 3 assistant secretaries who had consistently blocked Greenland defense initiatives. The response from Washington was swift and devastating. On May 3, 1937, Peter received a coded message. His services were terminated immediately. The Bureau disavowed all connection with him. His Danish diplomatic cover was revoked by Copenhagen under American pressure. And a warrant was issued for his arrest on charges of identity fraud, illegal radio transmission, and, most seriously, defamation of federal officials under the newly expanded Espionage Act of 1917. Peter Madsen, who had served American intelligence for 13 years, was now officially an enemy of the United States. The SS wanted him dead. The FBI wanted him imprisoned. And his only refuge was the largest ice desert on Earth. The Greenland ice cap is not survivable. This is the first principle of Arctic exploration, confirmed by the deaths of dozens who tested it. Temperatures average -30 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, -60 degrees Fahrenheit in winter. Winds reach hurricane force without warning, creating ground blizzards that eliminate all visibility and sense of direction. Crevasses, cracks in the glacier hundreds of feet deep, are hidden by snow bridges that can collapse under a single person's weight. And the psychological pressure of isolation, of endless white in all directions, of the body's desperate need for calories in cold conditions, destroys minds with ruthless efficiency. Peter Madsen survived on the ice cap for 43 months. His initial plan was tactical, not strategic. He would hide for the summer of 1937, allowing the German search to exhaust itself, and the American legal case to lose urgency. He had established 6 supply caches across the central ice cap, positioned at 100-mile intervals along a route he had traveled twice with Inuit guides. Each cache contained dried meat, fuel, tents, and the pemmican, dried meat mixed with fat. That was the traditional Inuit survival food. With careful rationing, he could survive 6 months. The caches were his innovation, inspired by Inuit hunting practices but systematized with engineering precision. He had selected locations based on snow accumulation patterns, wind protection, and proximity to known routes. He had buried supplies 10 feet deep to prevent detection from the air, marking locations with subtle cairns that only he would recognize. It was a survival network unlike anything previously attempted in Arctic exploration, a bet that preparation could overcome the ice cap's lethal indifference. Summer 1937 became autumn, then the brief Greenland twilight of winter darkness. Peter moved between caches, always traveling at night to avoid aerial observation, listening for German search planes that never came. The SS expedition, it turned out, had been delayed by Himmler's preoccupation with internal Nazi politics. By the time it reached Greenland in August 1937, Peter was already deep in the ice interior. The Germans established their station, conducted their fruitless search of coastal settlements, and departed in October, leaving a small observation team that would be evacuated by submarine the following spring. Peter didn't know this. He assumed the hunt continued, that every unidentified plane was a potential threat, that his only safety lay in deeper isolation. He pushed further into the ice cap than he had ever traveled, beyond his supply network into unexplored territory where no human had ever stood. The psychology of this period, reconstructed from his surviving journals, reveals a man undergoing radical transformation. The Peter Madsen who had schemed and manipulated in Chicago's speakeasies and Washington corridors was stripped away by necessity. Deception required an audience, and Peter had none. Performance required social context, and he was alone with the ice. For months at a time, he spoke to no one, saw no living thing except occasional Arctic foxes that followed his scent trails hoping for scraps. His journals from this period, written in a code he had developed from Danish, English, and Inuit vocabulary, show an increasingly idiosyncratic mind. He developed elaborate theories about ice as a recording medium, believing that the glacier preserved not just physical objects but memories, emotions, historical events. He wrote extended meditations on time, on the irrelevance of human politics against geological scale, on the honesty of survival compared to the corruption of civilization. But he also remained ruthlessly practical. He taught himself to hunt seals at breathing holes in the sea ice, using techniques learned from Inuit hunters. He constructed a primitive but effective shelter system using snow blocks and salvaged materials. He maintained his physical fitness through enforced exercise routines, understanding that weakness in the Arctic was death. And he continued to gather intelligence, watching German weather stations from concealed positions, documenting their activities, maintaining the habits of observation that had defined his professional life. The winter of 1938 to 1939 brought the first external contact in 18 months. A Canadian geological survey team, mapping the ice cap's eastern margin for potential mining development, stumbled across Peter's camp. Their initial assumption was that he was a lost explorer or a castaway from some unknown disaster. His explanation, that he was a Danish-American businessman conducting private mineral surveys, was accepted without serious questioning. The Canadians provided medical supplies, news of the outside world, and crucially, a radio receiver that could pick up international broadcasts. What Peter heard changed everything. The Munich Agreement. The dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. The growing certainty of war. And most disturbingly, reports that the United States was still refusing to consider Greenland's strategic significance, still blocking defense preparations, still treating the Arctic as irrelevant to American security. He made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would not emerge from the ice to reclaim his identity, to clear his name, to resume his interrupted American existence. He would remain in Greenland, continue his observation of German activities, and prepare for the war he knew was coming. When that war arrived, the value of his intelligence would be undeniable, his service impossible to ignore. He would force the United States to acknowledge what it had tried to bury. The mechanism for this forced acknowledgement was already in his possession. During his months of isolation, he had compiled the most detailed intelligence archive ever assembled about German Arctic operations, technical specifications of weather stations, biographical data on every German scientist and SS officer, communication codes, supply routes, and contingency plans for military seizure of Greenland. He had documented Japanese activities in the Aleutians, British preparations for Arctic warfare, and Soviet intelligence operations against all of the above. This archive was his leverage, his insurance policy, his weapon against the bureaucratic enemies who had destroyed his official existence. He buried copies at multiple locations across the ice cap, creating a redundancy that would ensure survival even if he himself did not. And he waited.